right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're watching from. Welcome to our final session of this year's PAX Protection of Civilians Conference. I really want to thank everyone that's been participating so far, and also for those that are now tuning in for the first time. It is really great to have you here for this final part of our program. My name is Erin Bijl. I'm a senior project officer for the PAX Protection of Civilians team, and it's my great honor to be hosting this session, which is about a critical connection, resilience, and POC. Now, today's overarching theme is the POC champions in the future of warfare. And I think what we're going to be doing here today is focus more on that latter part, the future of warfare. So I think we all know or are getting convinced that we see the majority of conflicts these days playing out in urban settings. And I think this is a trend that it will continue to see in the future and maybe even see increased in the future. What this means for people is that people are living in densely populated areas that may come under attack, where they are highly dependent on urban infrastructure and services. And this infrastructure, in turn, is very much dependent on the resilience of infrastructure to compete with great shocks to the system. So I think that raises the question, if that is the future of warfare, what does that mean for the protection of civilians? How do resilience and POC influence each other, and how do they link up? Now, before I introduce our speakers and get to the nitty-gritty of resilience and protection of civilians, I would very much like to introduce a few housekeeping notes. If you've heard these before, I apologize, but I think we need to go over them again just in case. Please note that we are recording our sessions and that we will also make sure to make these recordings available on our website after the conference. Other than that, we very much encourage active participation throughout the conference and throughout this session. So that means that if people are here attending in person, they can raise their hand if they want to pose a question to our speakers. If they are participating remotely, please know that you can use the Slido module. If you're watching this session in full screen modus, maybe exit the full screen mode so that you can see the Slido module, and then you can just use that to input your comments and questions. Other than that, we also very much appreciate it if you want to publicize your participation in today's event. If you do so, we would very much enjoy it if you use the hashtag PAXPOC 2021 or if you tag us at PAXPOC. Other than that, I think if there are other speakers, please also tag them as well. Finally, if you are running into any technical difficulties while watching this session, know that you can go back to the platform, the event platform, the homepage. You can access the drop-down menu, and there is a live help desk where people can assist you with any difficulties you may encounter. Now, I know the poll is already active for some, maybe others who haven't seen it. There is now currently a poll that is asking you how strong you think the link between resilience and the protection of civilians is. Just please take a moment to complete that poll. You can do so using the Slideshow module. If you're participating in person, you can also just take out your phone and contribute. While we wait for the poll results, I would like to introduce our two speakers. Online with us, we have Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Atkinson, who is a retired British Army officer, also served with the Nato Allied Command Transformation, maybe better known as ACT, and he played a very important role in the development of the NATO POC policy as well as subsequent military handbook. Currently, he's an independent consultant who works on many themes that are of interest to us today, including urban conflict, human security, and of course, resilience. Andrew, it's absolutely wonderful to have you online with us today. Then, of course, we also have a speaker here with me in the studio, which is my own colleague, Marco Grandi, a military advisor at PAX, who before joining PAX served as a military officer for many years, also serving multiple overseas deployments, I think Afghanistan a couple of times, if I'm not mistaken, and who's also worked at NATO's Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE. Could I ask for the poll results to be uploaded, to be made visible for our audience? And then, Marco, I think it's up to you to reflect on that and to introduce our listeners to resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you all for joining us here today. Rather encouraging output from the poll. I see that 66% already see a strong connection, so that's going to make my job a lot easier, thankfully. Just to touch upon, again, some of the points that Erin's already made. So, as most of you are probably aware, in recent years, NATO has shifted its focus from out-of-area operations in places such as Afghanistan to somewhat do a return to the past and focus once again on collective defense against near-peer or peer adversaries, and I'm sure you all have a decent idea of who that is. To make this strategic shift even more challenging is the current trend, which seems to be getting exponentially stronger, of larger and larger urbanized areas. As you may be aware, many analysts predict that by 2050, between 70 and 75% of the global population will be living in urbanized areas. That means that unfortunately, the current trend of war amongst the people will undoubtedly continue, with the added complexities of urbanized areas that are growingly complicated, IT dependent, and therefore a system of systems, which the degradation of even just one of these systems will have significant effects on the civilian population. It's for this reason that this session will be focused almost exclusively on high-intensity or hybrid warfare within urbanized areas. We will address the two themes of resilience and POC, is really zeroing in on the connection between those two, and then address what this means for urban warfare. Unfortunately, there are slides, so I strongly encourage your participation. We welcome your questions and comments. This is somewhat of a groundbreaking presentation, because both concepts, while fairly well known within NATO, this is probably one of the first attempts to actually analyze the connection between the two. So without further ado, that is our title. And so, as I said, initially we'll give a brief outline on what NATO resilience is. We'll then move to defining NATO's POC policy, specifically its military framework, and then move on to POC in future conflicts and the connectivity between the two themes that I've already touched upon. I believe we've already started another poll. Just to kind of get a feel for our participants, we've asked the question, what is your level of understanding or knowledge of NATO resilience? And I'd be curious to see the results in the coming minutes. In the meantime, however, Andy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Marco, thank you very much. Can I just do a quick sound check? Can you all hear me there? Okay, brilliant. So thanks, great for that introduction. Marco, if we could just click on 2, that'd be great. And one more. So I was just reflecting back on what some of the previous excellent panels were talking about, and about we never stop learning, and the situation changes, and I think that really goes to
Andy, can you hear me? We seem to have lost you. Okay. Well, thankfully, I'm fairly up to speed on resilience and can probably cover in Andy's absence. So resilience was, let's say, consolidated as a concept within the Alliance in approximately 2016, same period during which the POC concept really came to the fore. And so, as you can see there in the slide, that's the definition of NATO's understanding of resilience. It's not, let's say, an agreed upon term as of yet. So we've borrowed from our good friends at the CIMIC Center of Excellence and their handbook, and which they define resilience as a society's ability to resist and recover easily and quickly from a major shock, such as natural disaster or an armed conflict. Resilience is a combination of civil preparedness and military capacity. So obviously in this context, we'll be looking at the shock generated by a major conflict. Both, let's say, actually, and I'll correct myself, a hybrid conflict, but also leading up to a high-intensity conflict against a near-peer competitor. We recognize, however, that this is not the only definition of resilience. Other international organizations that have a different perspective also have their own specific definition, but this is the working definition with which we'll work upon during this session. This is a really good slide because it kind of highlights the tendency of resilience, of in terms of national resilience with regards to shock against time. So as you can see, as the crisis generally becomes more intense, there's an initial peak in national resilience until the shock hits, and this generates let's say, a phenomenon that overwhelms national capacity to respond, and so we see an initial drop in the resilience, and then the nation and its allies work together to try and respond and recuperate in the quickest time possible. Andy, I see you're with us again. Can you take over?
Yeah, absolutely. If a guide highlights that exactly, but one of the other points we need to bring out here is the impact of reverberating effects. So it's not as simple as, we take one shock and a big dip, that will be the initial start of a conflict. But what we tend to see is a series of aftershocks that go on. So these reverberating effects that keep going and keep going. And what that does is it undermines that capacity baseline. So we tend to see that baseline not being static, but moving down. And that's going to be one of the things we need to look at going forward, so it's not just a static environment, but it's very much a dynamic environment. And that's kind of why we need to assess where resilience is. And that's kind of where one of the connection POC also comes in, going to the future. If we go on to the next slide, Marco, and click on. So when NATO talks about resilience, I think, Marco, you covered it. When it was born in the Warsaw Summit 2016, it was very much looking about how does the environment out there support NATO's ability to conduct military operations. So it's about, is there civilian capacity in there in terms of road networks and communication networks and food and water supplies that allows the military to get on and do its job. But one of the other important changes, I think, that's happened over the few years since NATO put the
As I can see, Murphy is always on duty, so I'll jump in there again until Andy's back with us. So really, societal resilience is another, while not maybe an integral part of the 7 baseline requirements, which we'll see in the next slide, it's a complementary aspect of resilience. And it really focuses in on trying to understand what are the vulnerabilities that a specific community society are facing, first at the individual level, then the group, and then the society as a whole. So it's really a layered effect. And we really try and understand already in the pre-crisis phase, what are those potential fault lines within that society? What are the weak points that we need to address and try and respond to before the crisis actually hits? A very important part, and perhaps one of the greatest challenges for NATO, is the role of the member states. Now, as you would imagine, and it'll become more clear when we take a look at the 7 baseline requirements, the role of the member state, of the host nation, is dominant. National resilience, for how NATO defines it, is a national responsibility. And so really, the role of NATO is that to support, upon request, the NATO member states if they require it. There is a little bit of shift in that, in the sense that understanding that NATO supports the host nations in planning and preparing for operations, it does have visibility on the current level of national resilience, but that information is provided solely on a voluntary basis from the host nations themselves. In actual fact, the real only leverage that NATO has to kind of obtain that information is very much cemented in Article 3 of the treaty itself. And as you can see there, it states that the nations have the responsibility to prepare, both in terms of capacity and capability, for an eventual crisis and an armed attack. Andy, are you back with us?
I am, yes.
Over to you once again.
So great, and sorry for this. It's the challenge of being abroad. So if we can move on one slide to look at what the 7 baseline criteria are. This is quite, I would say, an interesting slide in that we've used this in wargaming to try and understand the resilience criteria, of which there are 7, which you can see across the top. On there, so the connections to continuity of government, critical services, energy supplies, the ability to deal with uncontrolled movement, food and water, mass casualties, communication systems, and transportation networks. What's interesting was when this was initially designed, it's for, I think, as Marco, you said, for nations to kind of reflect and look on themselves and make that assessment, which is quite challenging for NATO because, of course, they're not going to share their strengths and weaknesses with partners. But it's not only at the strategic level where this is important, it's also important at the operational tactical level, because this is almost the metric that gives us a really good understanding of what the current civil or societal environment is like. And of course, all these are connected. And we'll come on to this, why this is important in a bit, not only from a POC perspective, but also from an operational perspective. If we think that a lot of crises and conflicts, the overarching goal is to attack that government and institutional aspect. So measuring these metrics as we go forward is kind of really important. And we'll come back to this as we look to the future of warfare. So Marco, if you can take us on to POC.
Yeah. If I can just add one quick thing to those 7 baseline requirements, we'll just to make things a little bit easier, we'll refer to them as BLR, also because it's just a little bit quicker for myself. But I'm just taking a look now at the results of the poll. So the question is, what is your level of knowledge of NATO resilience? So I see that as normal as it is, not too many people are familiar with it. Hopefully will help you in becoming a bit more friendly to this new theme that NATO's working on. So if you take a look at those 7 baseline requirements, there's one in particular there, mass movement of people, which is rather a current topic in specific parts of NATO's backyard. It should be clear, however, that we're not talking about minor movements of a couple of thousand people. The actual criteria is to be considered mass movement. We're talking about 2% of the national population. So it starts to become a considerable number. It's not just the traffic jam at peak hour. Moving on now to POC, it's great to see that many more of you are familiar with the NATO POC concept. Hopefully you'll be even more so by the end of this presentation. What you see now, take a step back. As I mentioned before, the POC policy was born pretty much in 2016 out of the NATO Warsaw Summit. It really, I can't say I'm completely impartial because I was part of the POC team within NATO from about 2017 on. But I think there's some very innovative aspects on there, which I hope to touch upon in a moment. But as you can see there, these are extracts from the actual definition of protection of civilians from a NATO perspective. I draw your attention to the avoid, minimize, and mitigate the negative effects that arise from NATO operations on the civilian population. And as you can see there, it's implicit that it is impossible to completely negate the negative effects of conflict on the civilian population. And NATO recognizes that, and it comes out in some aspects of the policy, particularly the fact, as we'll see in mitigating harm, that it recognizes itself as a potential perpetrator of harm, but more on that in a moment. Point 2, we address the physical violence, but also the threat of physical violence on the civilian population. And I think one of these more current examples for NATO would be the authorization of military operations over Libya prior to what we were led to believe would be a massive offensive on behalf of the Gaddafi regime against the civilian population. And finally, the third aspect there, the contributing to a safe and secure environment, also known as CSACE.
Yep, Marco, could I just make a point here?
Please do.
And it goes back to that 2016 conference. So both POC and resilience came out the same summit, but they were looking at different ends of the NATO spectrum. So resilience was really focused on collective defense and looking forward, and POC was really focused on outer area operations, which I think brings us to where we are now, where they're both coming together.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Now on this next part, I'm probably going to spend a couple of minutes more because I really think it's critically important, both to the policy but also to resilience. So as you can see, this is the military framework. So this is actually the guiding diagram that really supports the planning and the conduct of military operations. And I think if I can just take a quick step back, another point in common that both resilience and POC have is they're both essential, both in the planning for military operations as well as the conduct of those military operations. So as you can see there, the POC framework is composed of 4 elements. It's 3 lenses and 1 overarching element known as understanding the human environment. Now, this is relatively innovative for a military force to consider these aspects. So when we talk about understanding the human environment, we're actually talking about adopting a human-centric approach to the operating environment, already in the planning phase of a military operation. And what we mean by that is that planners and operators have to really make the mental mindset change of attempting to put themselves in that operating environment as a civilian and trying to identify not just the threats, but also the potential threats to that civilian population. And while, yes, traditionally we talk about physical violence, it's not the only it's not the only threat that we need to identify. But with regards to that physical violence, we need to do a detailed threat analysis where we attempt to understand what are the drivers of that physical violence, what are the means, what are the motivations, what are the modus operandi in conducting those physical attacks against the civilian population. But as I said, those threats to the civilian population are in fact much more overarching and diversified. So we're also considering threats to livelihood and even the potential threats coming from the environment and how that can put civilians at risk. And another very important part is also identifying who are the potential perpetrators of violence, who are the potential providers of protection, how are they perceived by the local population, how are host nation actors and even international forces perceived. That understanding is critical to the planning and to driving operations. Now, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but my personal experience when I deliver this, particularly to military stakeholders, I wish I had €1 for every time I heard a military staff officer tell me, but Marco, we're already doing that. It's called analysis of the operating environment. We have our beautiful PAMESI tool. For those who've not worn a uniform, lucky you, PAMESI is in fact an abbreviation for analyzing an operating environment through the political, the military, the economic, the social, the security, the information, and also the infrastructural aspects of that environment, which is interesting. Also, the infrastructure part really plays well into the analysis of the 7 baseline requirements, but enough on that. So the response I've generally heard, Andy, is we're already doing it through that means. I would argue that that approach is very different from UHE. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So hitting the nail on the head, Marco. And when we were putting the whole concept together, the idea, military planners tend to look at the environment from the outside in because they're looking at their military goals, what they seek to achieve. And UHE was designed to try and get people to put themselves into the civilian's perspective on the ground and look outwards. So whilst militaries might think, through CIMIC or whatever, that some of their actions are what needs to be put on society to solve some of the problems that, sometimes they just aren't what actually a societal needs in terms of POC. So this is really genuine to try and get that societal civilian perspective from looking outwards rather than sort of NATO and military planners looking in.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I totally agree. I really like that phrase. The PAMESI approach really supports that outside looking in, whereas the UHE approach is more looking from the inside around and out, in my words. And the other thing is that PAMESI tends to be a more state security approach tool, and it just isn't really structured to capture that more human-centric security threat that UHE focuses on. So there's also that big difference, as well as the fact that you already touched upon that PAMESI is predominantly looking at the operating environment from a military perspective, while UHE lends itself much more to a more comprehensive and integrated understanding of the operating environment, which, as we look to most recent conflicts, a lack of ability in doing that has really hurt us in achieving our strategic goals, in my opinion. Another aspect, and here's where we try and bring the linkages in between resilience and POC again, unquestionably, in my opinion, the societal resilience has to be an aspect that you integrate into UHE there. Really, again, looking at the environment, seeing how resilient is that society, both at the micro level, so the individual, the group, and the community, but also how resilient is the nation, is the government, is its infrastructure. So again, the 7 baseline requirements would also be instrumental in providing that greater understanding. Because again, looking at the 7 baselines, if a nation has serious energy security concerns, then obviously the repercussions of those vulnerabilities on the civilian population are quite evident, as well as the limited resilience in terms of food and water. The impact on the human environment is very direct and very obvious, and I feel anyway.
Yeah, and Mark, if I can add to that, it's a two-way street as well. So whereas the military is looking to secure these environments, but the lack of these, lack of the 7 baseline resilience criteria from a civilian perspective has 2 things. One, it's impacting on the humanitarian aspects and the ability to survive. But the second aspect is, as we've seen in generally crisis around the world, that stresses society and can cause society and fractures into society to come to the fore, and that creates a security problem. So it's a two-way street, and that's kind of why it's really important, I think, for the militaries to understand this. It's not just the humanitarian aspect, but by doing so, they're also mitigating potential future security issues as well.
Absolutely. Andy, I've just got a question here from our virtual participants, and it reads, how do resilience and POC overlap? Is resilience part of POC? What are your thoughts on that?
It was never part of POC by design. Apart from when we're doing some of the early work, resilience and POC really overlap when we look at the contribution to safe and secure environments aspect, which is all about governments and institutions and capacities. Because the net outcome of POC, whilst it's not stabilization, is actually to mitigate all those sources of harm that can happen on society, not only just the kinetic aspects, but the ability for food, water, shelter, which are really exacerbated in an urban environment. It's actually quite fragile to disruption. And of course, the governance that goes over the top of that. It's not just militaries that can cause harm. Society can cause harm to itself, and criminality will always take place in these environments as well, and and opportunities. So the big overlap, to answer the question, I think, is in CSACE, and it's looking at what's the start point going to crisis. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the environment to sustain and support its population? How is that degraded, and where do we need to get that environment back to such that it's safe and secure for the population that's living in it?
As Erin will probably mention later, Andrew and I will be writing a paper on this very theme, and I think I'll have to buy you a drink at the bar because I kind of challenged that at that point, but I think it'll make for a very interesting discussion. I completely agree, CSACE is a big part of it, but I see a lot of overlap with the other lenses as well.
Yeah,
but for now, I'll push on. So now we actually get into the lenses themselves, and hopefully you're seeing now the mitigating harm slide. Now, mitigating harm can essentially be broken up into 2 areas. So mitigating harm from own actions. And again, this is where I feel that one of the more innovative aspects of the policy comes out, because NATO, as opposed to some other organizations, actually recognizes itself as a potential perpetrator of harm, whether it be due to human error, whether it be due to technical malfunction, even, let's say, deception from behalf of the opposing force, or unfortunately intentional because in pursuit of a military objective. So that's the first part. And another really interesting and I think laudable aspect of the policy is that it really tries to make the staff officers understand that harm is not just collateral damage, wounded, and fatalities. It's much more than that. And I've seen a growing understanding of having to try and address and identify the long-lasting reverberating effects. In some organizations, particularly ours, we really try to promote, in fact, the understanding that some of those military actions can generate long-lasting effects on development, livelihood, and psychological effects, as has been demonstrated in the previous sessions regarding the Hawija attack, for example.
Marco, on that,
Yep.
cutting you off, and I'm doing myself out of a drink in the bar, but but I agree. And going back to that baseline capacity of resilience, we talked about the shock effect, but if we think about that mitigate harm, as you just talked about, degrading the environment, that's really dropping that resilience capacity bar each time there's more military action. So it's not just one action, it's cumulative. So we only need to look at the actions in Mosul and other places to see, especially in the urban environment, how that harm degrades the environment, and that links to all the other lenses on POC.
And Andy, I'm going to latch onto your Mosul example, and this brings us to the second part of mitigating harm, which is mitigating harm from actions of others. So as over 30 years of crisis response operations has taught us, it is imperative that Allied forces have the authority to use force to mitigate harm against the civilian population. And of course, that's recognizing that some opposing forces will deliberately target the civilian population in order to achieve their strategic or operational goals, as happened in the Mosul example that you just offered up now. Going to the next slide. Okay, so here we kind of want to zero in on POC and resilience, mitigating harm within the urbanized area. So as you can probably appreciate, the challenges of urban warfare, as we mentioned before, is that the war will be essentially, the conflict will be drawn out within the urban area, in areas where it will be highly likely that the population is very elevated, there'll be a dense living space, and it will essentially be composed of a delicate systems of systems. Now, even simply degrading one of those systems, for example, a major conflict where humanitarian aid is being brought in through airports and seaports, the degradation of that critical infrastructure will severely hamper the provision of aid to the civilian population. And so again, the linkages with the protecting civilians is quite apparent.
Yeah, and Mark, go back to those 7 baseline criteria there. We only need to look at that picture and think, actually, how's that action degraded the ability? Obviously, food and water is kind of quite obvious, but it's the transportation networks, as you said, to get aid in that are disruptive. It's the communication networks to link and communicate with the population that are degrading those environments as well. So I think if you look through that picture, just imagine the 7 baseline criteria there. I think we'd start to see how that mitigate harm aspect through those actions, because each action is probably goes through the targeting bit, and in its own right is proportionate and against what it's trying to achieve. But when you look through the resilience criteria, you can see how that baseline of resilience is being chipped away at, and those reverberating effects have really created a POC challenge.
Let me raise the complexity a little bit further. So we said that we're considering a potential conflict against a near peer or even a peer competitor. So we could be facing, and I'm not saying anything classified, you can find this on open sources. So what are the added complexity of facing an adversary that has at their disposal an anti-area access denial, an A2AD system, a system that can protect or can project weapon systems that can deny allies the possibility of bringing in forces, but also aid and assistance to an allied nation. How do you see that, Andy?
It's great. It's a great question, and for me, it's a two bang for one buck, effectively. So an A2AD system prevents the military doing what it needs to do in terms of dominating the airspace. But at the same time, if we think about a NATO country, and this is our own population, our own people, we're going to be wanting to get that access to get food and aid into our own people at the same time. And an A2AD system will stop not only military access, but also those essential aid flights and civilian access as well. And the net result of that could be to advantage in terms of it's our own population. So it's going to increase the political pressure on NATO to actually try and solve this problem.
Couldn't agree with you more on that one. Going to now the next slide, which is hopefully facilitating access to basic needs, or FABN for short. Now, in this lens, as opposed to the first one, it's very clear that the military recognizes, or at least NATO recognizes, that it doesn't have a lead role in this one. It's more of a supporting role. But it also recognizes that a lack of basic needs will undeniably become a driver of instability and potentially violence. And so it must have some sort of a role in supporting particularly host nations in overcoming this challenge. Essentially, failure in this regard will significantly undermine the credibility of the democratically elected government. And this would be a nice segue, if we had time, into touching upon other concepts like democratic resilience, which is becoming even more important if you're able to get a hold of NATO's latest strategic concept, or at least the words of the Secretary General. He's again underline the importance within the strategic concept of safeguarding that democratic process. So again, FABN, with a bit of a stretch of imagination, you can also make a connection with the democratic resilience. But going back to the core meaning of FABN, you can essentially break that up into three components. So the first would be, again, mitigating the harm generated by the presence of a known force. So potentially we're in a combat environment where there's a large civilian population, the forces come in and is essentially causing a drain on the already limited resources. And again, tying in resilience, that could mean, again, limiting the baseline with regards to access to food and water, limiting the population's ability to have access to energy, for example, if the force isn't completely self-sufficient. So that would be the first part, mitigating its own harm. Then also access. Again, the military, NATO realizes that it could be called upon to have a role to facilitate humanitarian aid workers as well as the host nation government in accessing that part of the population that most needs that aid. Of course, the challenge there is how do you do that without violating some of the humanitarian principles, such as that of distinction, and that's obviously going to be specific to the operating environment, to the operating context. And the final part of that FABN part is also extending that civilian protection also to the humanitarian aid workers. And again, same challenge: how do you do that without violating the principle of distinction?
Yeah, and Marco, if you could just add to that, there are differences here as well. If you look at a NATO collective defense situation, whereas I think we know from the military perspective that the military comes in, whereas the aid workers have already been there for quite some time, and as we've sort of war gamed out, that there's a real possibility in a NATO Article 5 that actually the aid workers are riding at the same time. So there is this kind of question as to the role between the host nation, which could well be a NATO nation, and those NATO forces supporting it, and actually the UN agencies and aid agencies doing FABN as well. So I think there's a real question over who's leading at what particular stage, and there's a real driver for early coordination.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one other aspect I wanted to maybe touch upon with your help is, so FABN and the link to societal resilience. So again, maybe we have this high intensity conflict operation going on. Access to basic needs is quite limited. And all of a sudden, those social fragmentation lines, maybe along ethnic lines, maybe because we have displaced people coming from other areas that are then competing with those for access to those critical resources, that will further accentuate that social tension and really potentially undermine societal resilience. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would, absolutely. And it goes back to some of the early urbanization research work, where they were looking at things such as the impact of Hurricane Katrina, for instance. And a lot of the research was saying that actually within an urban environment, within any crisis, whether it's kind of warfare or something like a hurricane, actually, your time between the crisis hitting and society starting to break down is a matter of days, unless something's put in place. Typically the figure they were talking, the urbanization concept work, was around about 5 days, which I think in that context isn't very long, especially when that stress on society is in place.
Okay. Due to time, I'm going to move on. So the final lens is, of course, the contributing to a safe and secure environment. Now, once again, here, the alliance would be in a supporting role, the host nation probably coming to the fore here. And essentially, this is also very much tied into resilience in the sense that it attempts, particularly in a planning phase, to identify what are those critical vulnerabilities within the possibility of, for example, providing continuity of services on behalf of the host nation, which obviously tied into the first baseline, but also understanding their capacity and capability to protect critical national infrastructure. Thoughts, Andy?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think we already said you owe me a beer on that one. Completely agree. It is the major touch point, I think, where CSACE and its lens of understanding the critical infrastructure and capacities completely links with the said baseline criteria.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. I would now hand it back to you for really trying to bring those two lines together now.
Okay, thank you. So if we can go forward, Marco, another slide, and another, and just if you keep going to the POC and future conflict. Okay, so we talked about resilience and POC, and when we were looking at POC, we came with a strapline that POC is a humanitarian necessity and also a political imperative. And I go back to that point where POC came out of an era of intervention from a NATO perspective, and resilience started to look ahead about collective defense, and now we come to where those have come together. But the simple idea is this idea of NATO's center of gravity. So you can see in the strapline there that NATO guarantees the security of its territory and its citizens. So even in the NATO sort of declaration, it's putting people at the center of that, and it's really close to the center of gravity of NATO, which is its cohesion, and its cohesion has this kind of obviously political linkage. If we go forward one slide, and this isn't new. I've kind of stolen this idea from Clausewitz, so it's kind of basing around in the 1800s. But we have this sort of triangular relationship between the government, the military, and the people, where obviously the government is representing the people, the military draws its military personnel from the people, the military protects the people, and the government tells the military what to do. So in all of this, going back to this people, societal resilience aspect, and almost democratic resilience, that civilians have the same politics. And if you think about the idea of winning, especially in a NATO context where NATO is looking to not only deter and defend, but it's its own population, rather than necessarily the purely humanitarian aspect of being elsewhere in the world. So, a failure to protect and inadequate attention to resilience, I think, can lead to a lack of popular support that will not only impact the military instrument of power, but also, the political aspect. And it goes back to this idea of pressure building in future warfare, not just through military action, but across all the levers, what we call levers of power, which for me all converge onto civilian things. If we can go forward one slide, Marco, I'll go through a couple of ideas, and maybe we can just bounce these ideas around. And then there's this other idea as well in future warfare. It's conflicts on a continuum. There isn't kind of ramp up and we just go out to major warfare. It will go up and down. Hybrid warfare and hybrid strategies will be in play, using other mechanisms to gain political advantage. And there's this other idea that no front lines, really, it's a connected world. And we have this action-reaction type of thing, where an event in one part of the world could quite easily reverberate back and have a reaction somewhere. So this idea that nations need to understand themselves from a resilience perspective is really important to understand how, on reverberating actions, an action in Eastern Europe might have a reaction that takes place within the homeland in London that seeks to undermine the alliance. But I think at the center of this is this civilian population idea that no matter, and it's really sad, but civilians will be targeted for influence and adversaries will always seek to undermine states by causing stress. And for me, this idea of war amongst the people, cities, the rest of it leaves that fairly open in terms of an entry point, a vector for actions in the future. And we only need to see perhaps recent events, this idea of weaponizing populations for political effect coming to the fore. If you can go on one slide.
Andy, before I do, I just see that there's another great question here. So what are specific challenges to resilience for democratic countries in future urban warfare? So it kind of ties in with this last slide here. Do you want to have a go at it first, and then I'll try and clean it up?
Yeah, a good one. That's a cracking question, and it comes back down to, I think, governance. And the bottom line of this is the responsibility of a state to protect its population, and if it's not doing that undermines that political settlement and creates stress, and no more in an urban environment. So one of the big challenges in an urban environment is actually they're relatively fragile, that they don't grow their own food, they require net importers of food, those sort of activities, that they are vulnerable to damage to infrastructure in terms of food, water, sanitation. So as a vector to increase stress on the population, that's really, really high. And that stress on the population will play out very quickly into the media and have an influence on the governance aspect. So, almost the urban environment is a catalyst and a magnifier for all these resilience and POC issues we've been talking about.
If I can add to that, I think it's no secret that the blanket is pretty short. It's not very long. I think it's recognized within the sphere of experts in resilience that you can't plan for everything. You can't be fully resilient across the board. There will be gaps. There will be issues. And I think the only way, those challenges to the democratic nations are going to be very specific to each nation. So one country may not have issues when it comes to energy security. The further east we move, the more that threat becomes, that vulnerability becomes emphasized. The secret, I think, is really in playing to the strength of the alliance, and that is mutually supporting one another, as we saw with the COVID crisis. It's a little bit concerning from a security point of view that it's just taking the pandemic to really push national resilience across several lines, including obviously the ability to respond to mass casualties. But I think, again, the alliance really stepped up and provided a critical forum for the coordination of that support, and did give a significant contribution to overcoming some of those challenges. But yes, in a major conflict where the enemy or the opposing force will play against all of those baselines simultaneously, something will break. The question is, how quickly can we respond and recuperate? What will be the degree of cooperation that we can expect and hope for? I think that's part of the solution there. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'll let you continue, Andy, seeing as time's a factor.
I'm sort of conscious of time, actually.
Yeah.
So we'll go through the next couple of ideas, and then hopefully we can get to the slide at the end. So we talked about this idea of vectors. I know, Marco, you talked about PAMESI earlier, but this is sort of the general idea that we have looking at future warfare. So if you look at the political, military, economic, societal, infrastructure and information lens, and we get this idea, that warfare is always political at some point. It's all about applying political pressure, and future warfare and hybrid warfare isn't just about military on military, because actually, there's much gain on that. But there's a lot of talk about influence, and the vector for influence typically is always through the societal aspect, through civilians, through populations, and whether that's direct kinetic action or whether that's more indirect action. So we can have direct kinetic action that's causing harm to civilians, that's impacting economic markets, that's impacting on that safe and secure environment, and that's applying pressure onto the political aspect. So that's kind of one of these big things. I think we're looking to the future. There is this connection between resilience and POC, where resilience, I think, counters some of those vectors, and POC looks at those threats to society at the same time. So understanding those two aspects, I think, in future hybrid warfare, and up to peer-on-peer, we can really start to come up with some sort of strategies as to how to mitigate some of these aspects. Marco, any thoughts on that?
Just a quick question, Andy. In using the PAMISI approach, you did that through a UHE methodology, didn't you?
Yeah, so exactly. Of course I did.
Right. Thought you might.
Yeah, great. If you just
next
move
slide.
on. Yeah, and so this next slide goes to this thing about labels, and I think labels in the future are quite dangerous. Whereas it goes back to, where do these two concepts come from? One, resilience was looking at collective defense, that top blue circle, and really a POC was coming out of this combination of cooperative security and crisis management. And if you leave them in those boxes in the future, there's a danger people say, well, actually, we're not in crisis management or crisis response, so I don't need to do POC, or resilience is just a collective defense thing. And that's not true. And I think when NATO looks at its next strategic concept, we'll see these three core tasks merging much more closely, and you can see the blend on the right hand side there. How that's going to affect a lot of its kind of concepts and some of its doctrine, where we'll have counterinsurgency and stabilization and POC and counterterrorism and capacity building all happening at the same time. They're all significant factors that have to be looked through concurrently, and there isn't a sequencing to this, and I think that's really important in looking at the future challenges. So if you can go to the next slide, Marco, and I'll sort of try and bring this to the thing. So the so what for me across all of this, people are what we call the strategic glue. For warfare, sad though it is not about protecting populations or your interest. Then actually. What is it? If you take the people away from conflict, then there should be no conflict. Otherwise it's just sheer barbarism. That's barbarism anyway. So I think understanding the vulnerabilities, both from resilience and POC lens, will really help mitigate those threats. And actually, I think it's central to protecting those political relationships as well. So exactly. So understanding that, we can understand how perhaps future society could be exploited, and actually put those measures in place. With that, that's my last slide. Before we sort of try and bring this together on connectivity, Marco.
Yeah. Before we do, Andy, I think it's really important to kind of already start to draw a mini conclusion. So resilience is important because in the current mindset, it enables military operations. But we, I believe, would argue that it's also of strategic relevance to the mission, because enhanced resilience transfers into enhanced capacity and capability to protect your civilian population. And going back to your slide of the relationship between the population and the host government, if that government cannot provide effectively for the protection of its population, that glue will come less. That will generate political tension. That will also translate into tension between member states. So as you rightfully pointed out, at that point, we're starting to threaten the cohesion of the alliance, which is what NATO is all about, is it not? So in simple words, enhanced resilience capacity translates into enhanced ability to protect your civilian population, which in turn reinforces your strategic objectives and your center of gravity as a military alliance. Would you agree?
Yeah, could agree more. And very well put.
Next slide. So we've just got a few more minutes before we have to wrap up, and I think this is a really good graphic way to kind of bring together everything that we've been talking about. This should really kind of highlight where the 7 baselines can potentially be tied to the various lenses of the POC framework. Now, as you've already mentioned, there is overlap. That's another interesting aspect of resilience and POC. The baseline requirements can't be taken by themselves. It's not that if you impact one of those elements, for example, energy security, it won't have reverberating effects on the other 7. It most certainly will. So that's the overlap there. So, for example, if energy security becomes an issue, then that will challenge the government's ability to provide essential services. It will challenge the ability of the nation to respond to mass casualties. It will impact its ability to manage transport and also telecommunications. So there, you'll see also in this slide here, one baseline can be applicable to multiple lenses, because just with the POC, just like with resilience, these lenses overlap as well. There's one size does not necessarily, one aspect is not necessarily fitting into just one box. So hopefully that will come out here. So if I was to challenge you now, Andy, if I said, which of the 7 baseline requirements would you see best fit into mitigating harm, for example?
Okay, it's a great question, because of course, there's 2 sides to that. So if you look at our own harm from ourselves, so especially if it's in our own nation, so we can have damage to critical infrastructure and national infrastructure. That's going to impact on power grids. It can impact on mass casualties and the ability to do that. Any degradation in medical capacity will severely impact the environment. Communications is a natural one as well, and those transportation networks as well are likely to be degraded. And I think the other aspect there, also, if you looked at direct harm and mass casualties, there might be some adversarial aspect that might seek to cause harm and overload the medical capacities, and actually all that undermines the government. So that'd be my answer to the mitigate harm things. Probably covering six out of the 7 probably.
That's right. And now if we take a look at the next ones, I think this is really where we can highlight the fact that one, for example, mass displacement, that could be part of mitigating harm, because if as we see is happening in NATO's eastern periphery, we see the weaponization of people as a tool to undermine the stability of governments. So you would need to mitigate that threat. But at the same time, it would also fit into the facilitating access to basic needs, because of course this mass displacement would present basic needs that need to be fulfilled. Food and water would fit in nicely to the facilitating access to basic needs, whereas also the humanitarian access and the transport networks, they all fit in there as well. Power and energy, this one I would say would really be kind of an overarching one. And here are the others. So I think this slide really summarizes nicely where we see the overlap between those 7 baseline requirements and the framework. Just due to time, I'll quickly try and summarize the key points of our session. In my eyes, resilience is not only a military enabler, and that seems to be where most security specialists kind of put it. It is unquestionably also, however, a tool to address the protection of civilians. Both are strategically relevant. Therefore, if you are able to enhance resilience, not only is it a deterrent against attack, so you have that military aspect, but it also increases your possibility to enhance protection for your population, and that supports military strategic objectives as well. And finally, both consolidate, so both resilience and POC consolidate NATO's political cohesion and the cohesion within the member states, as we mentioned a few moments ago. The big problem? Both resilience and POC will be severely tested in a high-intensity conflict within an urban area. PAX, along with Stinson and the CAG group, recently held a tabletop exercise on POC in high-intensity urban conflict, and that became evident from day one. Both resilience and POC were significant challenges to the military's planning and conduct of operations, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. With that, I'll hand things back to you, Erin.
Yeah, thank you, Marco, and thank you, Andrew, both for your wonderful contributions and for today making that critical connection between resilience and POC. I think for me, I'm very interested to see how this debate continues and also how we can see sort of it being applied to other actors beyond NATO at some point. Just a few final notes before we hand over to Hans, who will close off the entire conference. First of all, the discussion that you have seen between Marco and Andrew today will also sort of be replicated in a paper that will be launched by the Stimson Center, I think in the next, the first half of next year. Yep. Exactly.
Thank you.
Please also know that if you are interested in this topic, you can visit the resource library for additional material on this, or you can always reach out to us at poc@paxforpeace.nl if you want to make any contributions to this debate. Andrew, thanks again also for being here online. I know we had some difficulties, but it was really great to have your contributions here. It was my pleasure to be a part of this debate. And with that, I will close this session and hand it to Hans. Thank you.